The view from the 45th floor was breathtaking. A sweeping panorama of the city, where lights flickered like scattered diamonds against the deep indigo sky. The skyline stretched endlessly, reflecting in the massive glass windows of the penthouse restaurant. The atmosphere inside was refined, almost sterile in its perfection. Hushed conversations, soft jazz drifting from the grand piano in the corner, the occasional clink of crystal glasses against fine china. Charlotte Caldwell sat at a private table near the window, her presence as striking as the view behind her. Dressed in an immaculate white suit, she exuded a quiet authority, her smooth brown skin glowing under the dim chandeliers. Her long locks were swept back into a sleek bun, not a single strand out of place. She moved with the ease of someone who belonged in rooms like these, rooms where decisions worth millions were made over a sip of bourbon. Across from her sat Nathaniel Caldwell, her father, and the man who built the Caldwell Grand Hotels empire from the ground up. Time had etched faint lines at the corners of his eyes, but his posture remained unyielding, his tailored navy suit sitting flawlessly against his broad frame. There was a quiet intensity about him, the kind that made boardrooms fall silent the moment he spoke. Tonight, however, it wasn't his usual air of calculated dominance that filled the space. It was something else, something heavier. A slow swirl of amber liquid circled in his glass as he studied Charlotte, his face unreadable. Outside, the city pulsed with life. Inside, an unspoken tension coiled between them like a drawn bowstring, waiting to snap. Charlotte, ever perceptive, felt it immediately. She had spent years proving herself, not just as his daughter, but as an executive in her own right. Harvard-educated, sharp, ruthless when necessary. She had learned how to command boardrooms and turn failing properties into profit machines. Yet, the way her father was looking at her now made her feel like she had already failed a test she didn't even know she was taking. The silence stretched. Then, finally, Nathaniel set his glass down, the sound of it meeting the table barely a whisper. And then he asked the question. The one that would change everything. Charlotte, have you ever spoken to the people who change the sheets in our hotels? The simplicity of it caught her off guard. She blinked, expression composed but slightly thrown. She had anticipated tonight's conversation to be about expansion plans, stock performance, perhaps even succession strategies, not housekeeping staff. A flicker of irritation passed through her, but she masked it well. She knew the business inside out. She had studied every financial report, dissected every quarterly projection. So why did it matter if she had spoken to a housekeeper? Her father was watching her now, and there was something sharp in his gaze, something that suggested he already knew the answer. She straightened slightly, smoothing an invisible crease on her sleeve before responding, her voice even. Dad, I don't need to talk to housekeepers to run a hotel empire. Nathaniel exhaled slowly, a quiet, almost disappointed sound. He leaned back, his gaze never leaving hers, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass in slow, deliberate circles. Then, finally, he spoke. And that is where you're wrong. The words were not spoken with anger, but they landed like a challenge, one she wouldn't see coming. The air in the penthouse restaurant seemed to thicken. The murmur of diners, the delicate chime of silverware, the distant hum of city traffic below. All of it faded as Charlotte processed what she had just heard. Her father sat across from her, his expression unreadable, the candlelight casting sharp shadows along his jawline. The way he held himself, calm, composed, suggested he had already made up his mind. This wasn't a suggestion. It was a decree. Charlotte let out a short, amused breath, her lips curving into the kind of smile that had disarmed countless investors in tense negotiations. She thought he was joking. She thought this was some elaborate test, a philosophical argument meant to make her reflect on leadership. But Nathaniel Caldwell did not waste words. The weight of what he had just said pressed down on her chest like a stone. He wanted her, his only daughter, his protégée, the woman being groomed to take over $1 billion empire, to strip herself of everything that made her who she was, and become a housekeeper. She folded her arms, settling back into her chair. The city glittered behind her, stretching out in all directions, a world she understood because she had conquered it. She had never set foot in one of their hotels as anything but an executive, never worn anything but designer suits tailored to perfection. Now, her father expected her to trade all of that for a cleaning cart and a uniform. Her fingers traced the rim of her wine glass, stalling. It was absurd. It was beneath her. And yet, Nathaniel's gaze never wavered. The unwavering, razor-sharp focus that had built an empire brick by brick was now directed solely at her. There was no humor in his expression, no room for negotiation. His challenge stood. Charlotte's amusement flickered, then died entirely. A slow realization crept over her, one that made her pulse tighten. This wasn't just about proving herself. This was a test of worthiness, not in his eyes, in hers. Her father believed there was something she was missing, something she wouldn't find in spreadsheets, profit margins, or luxury boardrooms. He was asking her to step out of the world she mastered and into one she had overlooked. And if she refused, that was the real question. The weight of unspoken consequences hung between them. If she said no, she would still be his daughter, still be a high-ranking executive. But she wouldn't be the heir. Charlotte felt a prickle of something deep in her chest. Resentment? Defiance? A challenge rising to meet his? She swallowed it down, pressing her hands together. No special treatment, no shortcuts. For 2 weeks, she would disappear. No one would know who she really was. She had spent years preparing to run this empire. Now she would find out if she was truly ready. She lifted her chin, a silent acceptance passing between them. Nathaniel nodded once, just enough for her to catch. It was settled, and for the first time in her life, Charlotte Caldwell had no idea what she had just walked into. The mirror reflected a woman she barely recognized. Charlotte Caldwell, poised, polished, untouchable, had vanished. In her place stood someone smaller, someone unremarkable. She stared at her reflection, taking in the transformation piece by piece. Her locks, always a statement of elegance and power, were now hidden beneath a plain navy blue headscarf, wrapped tightly enough to conceal but loose enough to feel foreign against her scalp. Her skin, usually radiant with high-end foundation and the subtle glow of professional lighting, was now bare. Every feature felt sharper, more exposed, the gentle curve of her cheekbones, the natural fullness of her lips, the dark circles beneath her eyes that she had never let show. Her hands, once adorned with delicate gold rings and manicured to perfection, felt strange, naked without polish, the nails clipped short, utilitarian. And then there was the uniform. A dull gray button-up with sleeves just a little too stiff, a pair of black work pants that sat uncomfortably against her skin, and old sneakers that had seen better days. It was more than a disguise. It was erasure. Gone was the confidence of designer heels clicking against marble floors, the subtle, intoxicating power of being recognized, respected, deferred to. She adjusted the collar of the uniform, feeling the unfamiliar fabric scratch against her neck. She had dressed in silence, but now the weight of it settled fully. This was real. Charlotte Caldwell no longer existed. The employee entrance of the Caldwell Imperial was a far cry from the grand, chandelier-lit lobby she had walked through so many times before. No scent of fresh-cut lilies, no classical music floating softly through the air. Instead, the sharp, sterile smell of bleach and industrial detergent clung to the narrow hallway, mixing with the unmistakable aroma of coffee that had been sitting too long on a hot plate. The walls, painted a dull beige, bore the scuff marks of 100 rushed footsteps, the occasional chipped plaster revealing layers of paint from years before. The air was thick, not just with the humidity from the laundry room down the hall, but with something else. A weight, a tension. The backbone of the hotel passed through these halls. Housekeepers, maintenance workers, kitchen staff, the invisible hands that kept everything pristine, seamless, luxurious. No one paid attention to her as she walked in. No one straightened their posture. No one greeted her with the careful, measured politeness reserved for a Caldwell. She was just another worker now. A woman in her late 50s hurried past, balancing a stack of fresh linens against her hip. A young man in a chef's uniform, his sleeves rolled up to reveal tattooed forearms, stood by the vending machine, rubbing exhaustion from his eyes. 2 housekeepers leaned against the wall near the break room, their voices low, shoulders heavy. No one noticed her. And for the first time in her life, Charlotte Caldwell was utterly invisible. The housekeeping office felt nothing like the grand, polished corridors of the Caldwell Imperial. Dimly lit, with only a single flickering fluorescent bulb overhead, the space was narrow and cluttered. Rows of battered metal lockers lined the walls, their paint chipped from years of use. A wooden bulletin board, filled with faded notices and overlapping shift schedules, hung askew next to an ancient time clock that clicked rhythmically as employees punched in and out. The air was thick with the scent of disinfectant, not the crisp, artificial cleanliness of a luxury hotel, but something harsher, medicinal, like a hospital hallway that had been bleached one too many times. A faint trace of sweat and stale coffee clung to the air, mixing with the sharp tang of lemon-scented cleaning solution. This was the nerve center of the hotel's unseen workforce, a world Charlotte had never stepped into. She barely had time to take in her surroundings before a voice, sharp, flat, uninterested, cut through the low murmur of conversation. Melissa Kane, the housekeeping supervisor, stood by a rusted metal desk, a clipboard balanced in one hand, a pen tapping impatiently against the surface. She was in her mid-50s, her blonde hair twisted into a too-tight bun, streaked with gray at the roots. A pair of reading glasses hung from a chain around her neck, but she didn't bother using them. Instead, her eyes, small, piercing, unreadable, flicked up briefly from the clipboard before she went back to whatever she was jotting down. She barely looked at Charlotte, not out of rudeness, out of habit. Charlotte, standing stiffly in her ill-fitting uniform, suddenly understood. Melissa had seen too many new faces come and go, too many new girls who lasted a week before quitting. Charlotte, to her, was just another in a long line of temporary bodies. Another replaceable worker who wouldn't last long enough to matter. A few other housekeepers loitered nearby, leaning against lockers, sipping from mismatched thermoses. No one greeted her. No one asked her name. She was simply absorbed into the system, a cog that had been slotted into place without ceremony. Melissa didn't bother with introductions, didn't ask about her experience, didn't explain the job. Instead, she flipped a page on the clipboard, scanned the shift assignments, and tapped a name with her pen. Floor 12. That was it. No explanation, no encouragement, no welcome. She moved to the next name on the list, already done with Charlotte before she had even started. Charlotte swallowed, shifting on her feet. the woman who had spent years walking into meetings where entire rooms of men stood to greet her, where her presence commanded attention and respect, was now being dismissed without so much as a second glance. She hadn't expected warmth. But she hadn't expected to feel quite so small, either. The clipboard snapped shut, and Melissa turned away, already absorbed in another conversation. Charlotte realized, with a strange sense of finality, that no one was going to guide her. No one was going to ease her. The service elevator rattled as it ascended, a dull hum vibrating through the metal walls. Inside, Charlotte stood with her cleaning cart, wedged between two women who couldn't have been more different. On her right, Rita Lopez, a woman in her early 40s, exuded an air of quiet strength. Her uniform, though worn, was impeccably clean, and her dark curls were pulled into a no-nonsense ponytail. Her brown eyes held warmth, the kind that came from years of hard work and resilience. There was something solid about her, something that said she had seen it all and still managed to keep going. On her left, Monica Evans leaned lazily against the railing, her arms crossed over her chest. Everything about her felt deliberately careless. From the way she had left the top button of her uniform undone to the way she popped her gum with a slow, exaggerated snap. Her light brown hair was thrown into a messy bun, a few strands hanging loose, framing a smirk that seemed permanently etched on her face. As the elevator lurched to a stop, Charlotte felt the weight of their attention shift toward her. Rita turned first, offering a small smile as she adjusted the belt of her cleaning apron. She had the kind of face that reminded Charlotte of the neighborhood mothers growing up, the ones who always had an extra plate of food ready, who knew how to soften a hard day with a few kind words. Rita gave Charlotte a quick once-over, as if assessing how long she would last. Then, with an almost maternal ease, she said, "First day?" Charlotte nodded. Rita's smile widened just a bit. "Stick with me, honey. You'll be fine." The words were simple, but they carried a quiet reassurance, a sense of belonging where none had existed before. Then came the sound of a scoff, low, dry, filled with something that wasn't quite amusement, but something close to it. Charlotte turned just in time to see Monica roll her eyes. Unlike Rita's warmth, Monica's expression was all sharp edges, the kind of look a person gives when they've already decided they don't like you before you've even had the chance to speak. There was something too casual in the way she leaned against the cart, the way her gaze flicked over Charlotte, slow and assessing, like a cat watching a mouse just before pouncing. Monica let the silence stretch. Then finally, with a smirk, she said, "Newbies clean the bathrooms." That's the rule. Charlotte felt something settle in her stomach. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even surprise. It was recognition. She had seen this kind of woman before, not in housekeeping uniforms, but in designer heels and tailored blazers, the ones who held just enough power to make life miserable for those beneath them. The ones who never worked harder than they had to, but always knew how to take credit when things went well. Charlotte didn't respond. She didn't need to. Because Monica was already turning away, already acting as though the conversation was over, as though her word was law. The elevator doors slid open with a faint ding, revealing the long, carpeted hallway of the 12th floor. Soft, golden lighting. Elegant decor. A world away from the fluorescent buzz of the employee break room. Monica stepped out first, stretching as if this were just another slow, easy day for her. Rita followed, grabbing her supply cart without a word. Charlotte pushed her own cart forward, feeling the weight of the day already pressing down on her. It wasn't just the work ahead of her. It was the realization that in this world, a world she had never thought twice about before now, she was at the very bottom. And Monica was determined to keep her there. The first thing Charlotte noticed wasn't the work itself. It was how little anyone noticed her. In the gleaming hallways of the Caldwell Imperial, where high-powered executives brushed shoulders with the elite, where designer luggage rolled silently across plush carpets, and where every interaction was wrapped in layers of carefully practiced politeness. The housekeeping staff didn't exist. They moved like ghosts, pushing their carts, slipping in and out of rooms, wiping away the evidence of someone else's stay. And no one looked at them. Not the businessmen in tailored suits who walked past without breaking stride, engrossed in their Bluetooth calls. Not the women in elegant cocktail dresses who barely glanced up from their phones as they brushed past. Even when they were standing right there, even when Charlotte was inches away from them, guests moved around her like she was part of the furniture. And then there were the rooms. Some were left in reasonable disarray. Unmade beds, towels scattered on the floor, half-finished cups of coffee left on nightstands. Others were worse. She walked into one suite and felt her stomach turn. Red wine soaked into the carpet. A pile of discarded clothes tossed carelessly in the corner. The bathroom sink cluttered with crumpled tissues, half-used toiletries, and a faint smear of something Charlotte didn't want to identify. The bed, unrecognizable beneath a mess of tangled sheets, spilled food, and what looked like remnants of an expensive dessert, was the worst. A fork, still coated in chocolate mousse, lay stabbed into the mattress as if it had been planted there deliberately. Charlotte exhaled slowly. Whoever had stayed here had never once thought about the person who would have to clean up after them. Monica, of course, had vanished. It wasn't until an hour later that she reappeared, sauntering down the hallway with the slow, casual ease of someone who had spent the last 60 minutes doing absolutely nothing. Charlotte was still scrubbing the bathroom floor when she heard it. The sound of heels clicking against marble, fast, impatient. A woman's voice followed, sharp and dripping with annoyance. "This is disgusting." Charlotte barely had time to turn before the guest appeared in the doorway. A well-dressed woman in her 50s, her platinum hair swept into an elegant updo, her silk blouse crisp and unwrinkled, despite the frustration radiating off of her. Her manicured hand gestured toward the bathroom sink, where makeup-streaked tissues still littered the counter. Monica had skipped this room. Charlotte knew it. But before she could open her mouth, Monica stepped forward with a perfectly rehearsed look of sympathy, tilting her head just enough to feign concern. "Oh no, ma'am. I'm so sorry about that." Her voice was syrupy sweet, the kind of fake politeness that made Charlotte's stomach tighten. Then, without missing a beat, Monica turned toward Charlotte, her expression shifting from concern to mild disappointment. "New girl's fault," she said smoothly, sighing as if the entire thing was just one unfortunate misunderstanding. "She probably doesn't know how to clean properly yet." Charlotte felt her spine stiffen. For a split second, her instincts screamed at her, to correct Monica, to defend herself, to let this woman know exactly who she was really dealing with. But then she saw it. The way Monica stood just a little taller, her smirk barely hidden behind the mask of fake professionalism. She wasn't just shifting blame. She was testing her, seeing if she would snap, if she would fight back, if she would fold. Charlotte's jaw tightened, but she didn't take the bait. Not yet. Instead, she swallowed the anger rising in her throat, nodded once, and turned back toward the sink, grabbing a fresh rag with steady hands. She had 2 weeks in this world, 2 weeks to see it all. And if Monica thought she was going to get away with this forever, she was dead wrong. The room was spotless. The bed, once rumpled from a long-forgotten guest, had been remade to perfection. Sheets smoothed and tucked so tightly they could rival a 5-star military inspection. The pillows were fluffed and stacked neatly, their edges aligned with precise symmetry. The faintest scent of freshly laundered linen lingered in the air, the only evidence of the hour Charlotte had spent scrubbing, folding, and straightening every last detail. She took a step back, surveying her work, her fingers tightening around the damp rag in her hand. Then came the sound, the slow, deliberate click of heels against the marble threshold. Charlotte didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Monica. The weight of her presence slid into the room like an unwelcome draft, slow, lazy, unapologetically smug. Charlotte could already picture the expression. That smirk, that half-lidded gaze, the way her arms would be folded just so, as if she were simply observing something beneath her. A rustle of fabric, the shift of movement. Then, a splash. Charlotte's breath caught in her throat before she even saw it. Dark liquid seeped into the pristine white duvet, spreading in a slow, creeping stain across the smooth fabric. The coffee cup, once full, now overturned, teetered on the edge of the nightstand before toppling onto the carpet with a hollow thud. A deliberate accident. Charlotte turned just in time to catch the flicker of amusement in Monica's eyes, the curl of her lips, the sheer delight in watching someone else's work be undone in an instant. A low, drawn-out sigh filled the space between them, feigned regret dripping from every syllable. Oops. The word was light, airy, as if she were merely commenting on the weather, as if she hadn't just ruined an hour's worth of work with a flick of her wrist. Monica shifted her weight, leaning casually against the dresser, arms crossed, the picture of effortless cruelty. Charlotte felt something hot and sharp coil in her chest, the way Monica looked at her. Not just with condescension, but with satisfaction, with the certainty that she would not, could not fight back. Made her stomach tighten. For a brief, dangerous moment, Charlotte imagined a different scenario, one where she wasn't disguised as Lena the housekeeper, but where she was Charlotte Caldwell, standing in a power suit and designer heels, watching Monica squirm as security escorted her out of the building. But that wasn't the world she was in right now. Right now, she was nobody. Just another nameless worker. And Monica knew it. The heat in her chest burned hotter, spreading to her fingertips, her knuckles whitening as she clenched her fists just enough to feel the pressure, but not enough to be noticed. This wasn't the first time Monica had pushed her. But this? This was the first time she wanted Charlotte to break, to snap, to lose her temper, to make a mistake. Charlotte forced her shoulders to relax, forced the tension in her jaw to loosen. Then, without a word, she turned back to the bed. She reached for the sheets, yanking them free with steady, measured movements. She wouldn't give Monica the satisfaction. Not yet. Monica lingered in the doorway, watching for another few seconds before huffing a small, amused chuckle and strolling away. And just like that, Charlotte was alone again. But the moment Monica disappeared down the hall, something shifted. It wasn't just anger. It wasn't just humiliation. It was something colder, sharper, a realization. This had never been about simple laziness or passing cruelty. Monica enjoyed this. She didn't just want power. She wanted people to feel small, to feel like nothing. Charlotte inhaled slowly, her fingers tightening around the corner of the soiled duvet. She had played along so far, taken the humiliation, absorbed the blows. But this was the moment she decided. Monica thought she was in control. She had no idea who she was really dealing with. Something was wrong with this place. Charlotte had felt it in fragments before. The exhaustion in Rita's eyes, the way housekeepers moved like shadows, the tight-lipped silence whenever someone mentioned a problem. But now, the cracks in the foundation were becoming impossible to ignore. She had spent over a week scrubbing, folding, polishing, watching, And what she saw wasn't just laziness or bad management. It was something deeper, something rotting beneath the surface. She started noticing the patterns. Housekeepers were exhausted, stretched to their limits, clocking in at dawn, leaving after dark. Their bodies bore the quiet evidence of their labor. Calloused hands, aching backs, dark circles carved into weary faces. But their paychecks? Nowhere near enough to justify the work. Supervisors, when they bothered to acknowledge them at all, spoke in clipped tones. Do more. Work faster. Not my problem. Complaints didn't exist, not because there weren't any, but because no one dared to voice them. Charlotte caught glimpses of it everywhere. A housekeeper rubbing her wrist, eyes darting toward a manager before shaking her head when someone asked if she was okay. A man from maintenance muttering under his breath after being told to work overtime, only to fall silent the moment a higher-up walked by. Then there was Monica. She moved through shifts with an air of effortless detachment, never in a hurry, never breaking a sweat. While others rushed to finish their rooms before their next set of assignments, Monica lingered in hallways, scrolling through her phone, chatting up supervisors who mysteriously never questioned her lack of work. The housekeepers noticed, but no one said anything. Monica was untouchable. Charlotte watched as she conveniently forgot to clean rooms, left work for others, whispered half-truths into the right ears, knowing she'd never face consequences. It wasn't just that Monica was lazy, it was that she was protected. Charlotte didn't know by who. Not yet. But then, one night, she overheard something that changed everything. It was late, long past the time most executives had gone home, past the time guests had settled into their suites. Charlotte had been restocking supplies when she turned the corner toward the service hallway, intending to grab fresh linens. That's when she heard voices. Low. Serious. A conversation not meant to be overheard. She stopped, instinctively stepping back, pressing herself into the shadows of the dimly lit corridor. Two figures stood near the back entrance. One she recognized immediately. Monica. The other? A man in a navy suit, his face partially obscured by the dull glow of the emergency exit sign. But Charlotte recognized him. Stephen Grant, one of the senior managers, one of the men responsible for overseeing hotel operations. Her heart kicked against her ribs. He shouldn't be here. And yet there he was, standing too close to Monica, speaking in a voice just low enough that anyone walking by wouldn't think twice. But Charlotte had positioned herself perfectly, in the dark, unseen, listening. "Don't worry about it," Stephen muttered. "I'll handle the schedules. Just keep doing what you're doing." A soft chuckle from Monica. "So you're saying I have job security?" "You're saying you have leverage," he corrected, "and that makes you more valuable than half the idiots working here." A pause. Then, the unmistakable sound of paper sliding into a pocket, a bribe. Charlotte's fingers tightened into fists. This wasn't just favoritism, this was corruption, and suddenly everything made sense. Why Monica was never held accountable, why the workers were too afraid to speak up, why complaints never reached the right people. Because the right people were the ones burying them. Charlotte felt a slow, burning rage coil inside her. This had gone beyond simple office politics. This was exploitation. And now she had proof. She just needed to decide what to do with it. The hotel was different at night. Gone was the constant hum of guests filtering in and out, the polite chatter of the lobby, the steady stream of footsteps across the marble floors. By 2 a.m., the Caldwell Imperial became something else entirely. A place where the walls seemed to stretch taller, where shadows pooled in forgotten corners, and where silence wasn't peaceful, but heavy. Charlotte had learned to navigate these late hours in near silence, moving through back hallways with the kind of careful precision that only came from knowing you couldn't afford to be seen. That's why she noticed the voices before she even turned the corner. Low. Muted. Conspiratorial. She stopped just outside the supply closet on the 12th floor. The heavy metal door cracked open just enough for light to spill out onto the hallway floor. Inside, 2 figures stood close. Too close. Monica, leaning against a shelf stacked with folded linens, arms crossed, her body language loose and easy, as if she didn't have a single care in the world. Her voice carried the casual arrogance of someone who had never once feared consequences. Across from her, Melissa Kane, the housekeeping supervisor, stood with her arms folded. The clipboard was missing from her hands, and for the first time, she didn't look like the strict, no-nonsense manager who ran the department with an iron grip. Here, in the shadows, she was just a woman sharing a secret with a friend. Charlotte moved in closer, pressing herself against the wall, barely breathing as she listened. "Relax," Monica was saying, her voice laced with amusement. "You know I'd never let a real complaint get through." Melissa let out a short, dry chuckle, shaking her head. "Still, you need to at least pretend to do your job." Monica rolled her eyes. "Why? So I can scrub toilets for minimum wage like the rest of them?" She scoffed, shifting her weight against the shelf. "I send in the inspection reports. The execs don't actually check them. As long as it's in the system, it's done." Charlotte felt something cold settle in her stomach. So that's how she had been getting away with it. Monica wasn't just skipping rooms. She was falsifying records, marking inspections as completed without stepping foot inside. And Melissa? She wasn't stopping it. The supply closet felt smaller, more suffocating, as if the very walls of the hotel were complicit. Charlotte's grip tightened around the small object in her pocket. A voice recorder. She had started carrying it after overhearing Stephen Grant's late-night conversation, the quiet warning in the back of her mind growing louder each day. And now, as she stood in the dim hallway, listening to the 2 women lay bare the corruption that stretched beyond Monica's laziness, she pressed the button with steady fingers. The quiet click was swallowed by their conversation. Melissa sighed, rubbing her temple as if even she were growing tired of the charade. "Just don't be so obvious about it," she muttered. "If corporate ever does a real audit, I can't protect you." Monica laughed. "Please, you and I both know corporate doesn't care about housekeeping. We keep their numbers clean. They keep their eyes shut." Charlotte swallowed hard. It wasn't just laziness. It wasn't just incompetence. This was calculated, protected, expected. Melissa was in on it. And if Melissa, the one in charge of their entire department, was complicit, how many more were involved? The realization left a bitter taste in her mouth. This wasn't just about Monica cutting corners. It was about a system that allowed it, encouraged it, rewarded it. Charlotte stayed just long enough to record the rest of the conversation before stepping back into the darkness, the faint red light of the recorder still blinking in her pocket. She had come into this place as an observer. But now she was building a case, and when the time came, she would bring this entire house of cards crashing down. The presidential suite was the kind of luxury that existed in magazines and whispered conversations about the ultra-wealthy. A place where crystal chandeliers caught the evening light, where silk curtains pooled onto polished marble floors, where everything, from the embroidered robes in the closet to the scent of fresh-cut lilies, was designed to exude perfection. But tonight, that perfection had been shattered. The air was thick with tension, heavy with the weight of an accusation that could ruin someone. Charlotte stood in the doorway, her grip tightening on the cleaning cart's handle. Across the room, a man in a navy blue suit, his graying hair slicked back with precision, stood beside the unmade bed. His expression was one of barely restrained disgust, his fingers pinching the edge of the wrinkled, unchanged sheets, as if the mere act of touching them was beneath him. His watch, something sleek, expensive, deliberately visible, caught the light as he gestured toward the mess. "I paid for a 5-star experience," he muttered, shaking his head. "Not this." Behind him, Monica stood at a careful distance, just out of his line of sight, her expression a perfect mask of concern. But Charlotte knew better. She had spent 10 days watching Monica perfect the art of dodging responsibility. Monica hadn't cleaned the room. Charlotte knew it. Monica knew it. And now, with a guest complaining, someone had to take the fall. Charlotte could feel it happening before Monica even opened her mouth. The shift in posture. The slow exhale of someone preparing for a performance. Then, the words, smooth, practiced, dripping with just enough faux innocence to be convincing. "It was supposed to be cleaned," Monica said, shaking her head as if she, too, were baffled by the situation. "I gave it to the new girl. Maybe she forgot the sheets?" Charlotte's breath caught. There it was. The lie dropped into the room like a slow-burning fuse, waiting for someone to light the match. The executive's gaze snapped to Charlotte, eyes narrowing as he studied her uniform, the small embroidered name tag that read, "Lena." Charlotte opened her mouth. The instinct to defend herself was immediate, sharp, impossible to ignore. But before she could speak, Melissa Kane stepped in. The housekeeping supervisor had arrived quietly, standing just outside the door, her arms folded. Her gaze flickered between the guest, Monica, and Charlotte, calculating. And then, in a voice that carried the weight of finality, she said, "That's the second complaint this week, Lena." A pause. A deliberate moment of silence, letting the words settle. "One more, and you're done." Charlotte felt the ground shift beneath her. This wasn't just another instance of Monica dodging work. This was a warning, a public display of power, and Melissa had chosen her side. Monica didn't smirk. Not here, not now. That would be too obvious. But the satisfaction was there, lingering in the curve of her lips, in the way she crossed her arms like she had already won. Because she had. Charlotte wasn't just being blamed. She was being set up to fail. And if she wasn't careful, she wouldn't be here long enough to see the end of it. Monday morning arrived like the slow draw of a curtain before the final act. The Caldwell Imperial's executive boardroom, perched high above the city skyline, was a world away from the linen carts and bleach-scented service hallways Charlotte had spent the last 2 weeks in. Floor-to-ceiling windows bathed the room in natural light, reflecting off polished mahogany, gold-trimmed nameplates, and the unreadable faces of the company's top brass. It was a space designed for power. And today, it would witness a reckoning. The meeting had been called without explanation. Attendance was mandatory. Around the massive oval table, executives murmured amongst themselves, flipping through reports, checking their watches. Some looked mildly annoyed, others simply curious. At the far end of the table, Melissa Kane sat with the effortless confidence of someone who believed she had already won. Beside her, Monica lounged in her chair, one leg crossed over the other, feigning boredom. She had no idea what was coming. And then, the doors opened. The sound was sharp, decisive, cutting through the low hum of conversation. All eyes turned. Charlotte stepped inside. Gone was the stiff housekeeping uniform. Gone were the scuffed sneakers, the plain headscarf, the burden of invisibility. In their place, a navy blue power suit, tailored to perfection. Her locks, once hidden beneath cheap fabric, cascaded down her back in sleek, polished waves. Not a disguise, but a crown. She moved with the kind of authority that made the air in the room shift. Slow, deliberate, completely in control. Melissa went rigid. Monica froze mid-smirk, her posture stiffening as realization dawned. Charlotte didn't need to speak right away. She let the moment breathe, let the weight of her presence settle in the bones of every single person who had ignored her, dismissed her, walked past her as if she were nothing. Then, with measured precision, she reached for her apron, the same faded, stiff fabric she had worn for 2 weeks, and untied it in one slow, deliberate motion. The sound of the cloth dropping onto the table was deafening in the silence. A single heartbeat passed, then another. And then, with the kind of quiet power that made boardrooms fall silent, Charlotte Caldwell, the woman they had failed to recognize, failed to respect, failed to fear, spoke, and the reckoning began. It wasn't the kind of silence that came from respect or anticipation. No, this was the silence of people realizing they had been caught. Charlotte stood at the head of the table, a presence that demanded attention without raising her voice, without needing theatrics. Her navy blue suit was crisp, her posture effortless, her locks falling neatly over her shoulders like a statement of defiance. She didn't need to glance at Melissa or Monica to know what they looked like. She could feel it. Melissa, usually so composed, had gone rigid, her fingers clasped a little too tightly on the clipboard that wouldn't save her now. Monica, always so smug, always so untouchable, sat frozen in her chair. Her arms, which had once been draped lazily over the armrest, were now stiff, her nails digging into the leather as if she could claw her way out of what was coming. Charlotte let the moment stretch, long enough for them to feel the weight of what was about to happen. Then, she reached into the folder she had brought with her. And the truth began to unfold. The first photo landed on the table, a suite that had been marked as cleaned, but the sheets were still rumpled, trash overflowing from the bins, towels left in damp piles on the floor. Monica's signature had been on the report. A second photo followed. Another room, another lie. Guest complaint forms were next, stapled neatly, undeniable proof, each one a thread in the unraveling fabric of Monica's deception. Unacceptable housekeeping standards. Dirty sheets. Room not cleaned despite check-in confirmation. Charlotte flipped to the next page. And then, the final piece. A USB drive. She slid it across the table, her fingers steady, deliberate. Melissa had gone pale because she knew exactly what was on that drive, the recordings. Monica's voice, so full of arrogance, boasting about skipping work, bragging about how she doctored reports, laughing about how she could do whatever she wanted. Melissa's voice, cold, calculating, admitting to covering for her, manipulating performance reports, silencing complaints. The air in the room had changed. It wasn't just shock anymore. It was realization. Realization that everything they had built on lies was collapsing in front of them. Charlotte didn't rush. She let each piece of evidence land, let each breath tighten in their throats. And then, finally, she looked up. And when she did, her gaze landed directly on Melissa and Monica, 2 women who had spent weeks trying to break her. They had no words now, no lies to spin, no excuses to hide behind, because the truth was right there, in front of everyone. And there was no escaping it. The weight of the room had shifted. Before, the Caldwell Imperial boardroom had been a place of quiet power, where decisions were made behind polished mahogany, where people like Melissa and Monica had operated unchecked, hidden behind bureaucracy and corporate blind spots. But today, it had become something else. A courtroom, and Charlotte was the one holding the gavel. Silence hung thick in the air as the last piece of evidence settled on the table. as the damning reality of what had been exposed seeped into every corner of the space. Melissa and Monica sat frozen in their seats, their faces drained of color. For weeks, they had carried themselves with the unshakable arrogance of people who believed they were untouchable. Now, that certainty was gone. Melissa's fingers twitched against the surface of the table, gripping the edge as if she could hold on to whatever authority she had left. But there was no salvaging this. Not after the guest complaints, the forged reports, the recordings that had played for the entire executive team to hear. Not after Charlotte had peeled back every layer of their corruption and laid it bare for everyone to see. A chair scraped against the floor as Nathaniel Caldwell, CEO, founder, father, stood. He had been silent through most of the meeting, letting Charlotte take the lead, watching her with a careful, unreadable gaze. But now, he stepped forward. His voice was measured, firm, a voice that had built this empire from the ground up. "There is no place for this in my company." Melissa barely breathed. Monica, who had spent the past 2 weeks smirking, taunting, reveling in her false sense of power, now looked small, insignificant, her confidence crumbling beneath the weight of reality. The words came swift, final. "You're both fired." The sentence landed like a hammer striking steel. Monica opened her mouth, but no excuse would save her now. Melissa tried to protest, but even she knew it was over. Security arrived within minutes. They didn't shove, didn't force, didn't humiliate, but they didn't hesitate either. Melissa and Monica were escorted from the boardroom with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the weight of their mistakes trailing behind them. Charlotte didn't watch them leave. She had bigger things to do. By the end of the day, changes were already in motion. Housekeeping policies, rewritten, wages, raised, supervisors, held accountable. For the first time in years, the workers who had been overlooked, underpaid, and ignored felt the shift in the air. And at the heart of it all, Charlotte Caldwell. Not Lena Carter, the invisible housekeeper, not just the CEO's daughter, but a leader, one who had walked their halls, cleaned their rooms, carried their burdens, one who had seen the truth from the ground up. When the formal announcement came later that evening, the press release, the email to every Caldwell Hotels employee, the official statement from the board, it was only confirming what had already been decided in that boardroom. Charlotte Caldwell was the next CEO, and things were never going to be the same again. The Caldwell Imperial felt different now. Gone were the strained smiles, the hurried footsteps of overworked employees trying to stay out of sight. Gone were the whispers in back hallways, the silent nods exchanged between housekeepers who had long learned that speaking up meant nothing would change. The air felt lighter. Charlotte walked through the grand lobby, her heels clicking softly against the polished marble floor. The space, once a place where she had moved unseen, now welcomed her with quiet recognition. A bellhop straightened as she passed, nodding respectfully. A front desk agent, the same woman who had ignored her months ago when she was just Lena the housekeeper, offered a warm smile. But it was on the upper floors, beyond the chandeliers and the velvet drapes, that the real changes had taken root. The housekeeping staff no longer rushed through their shifts with hunched shoulders, afraid of reprimands for working too slow. Now, they moved with purpose, with dignity. Rooms were cleaner. Guests were happier. Because the people who maintained this place, the people who had been overlooked for too long, were finally being treated as more than just an afterthought. Charlotte stepped onto the 12th floor, the same hallway where Monica had once pushed the hardest, manipulated the most. But today, there was no Monica, no Melissa. Instead, there was Rita. She stood at the housekeeping station, a clipboard in hand, not as just another housekeeper, but as the new supervisor. The same woman who had once warned Charlotte about staying out of Monica's way now held authority, not fear. Charlotte stopped beside her, glancing at the schedule pinned to the board, neatly organized with proper break times, manageable workloads. Rita caught her eye and smiled. Not the tight, careful smile she had once worn, but something real, something unburdened. And then, something small but powerful happened. A housekeeper. Young, maybe in her early 20s, dark curls tucked under her cap, walked past them, pushing her cart. She paused just for a second, meeting Charlotte's gaze. Before, she would have looked away, like all the others had. But today? She smiled. Not out of obligation, not out of fear, but because she knew finally that she was seen. Charlotte held her gaze for just a moment longer, then nodded. She didn't need to say anything. The moment spoke for itself. The Caldwell Imperial had changed, and so had she.